September 20th, 1990, Burns Cut, San Joaquin River Delta, California. One fisherman, one garbage bag, one human leg. And the craziest part? The killer had practiced this exact method before, on a deer, in a bathtub, his own bathtub, in his own home. Sammy McCullough was a 40-year-old catfish farmer who kept large amounts of cash around his rural property. Someone shot him point blank in the forehead with a .22 caliber rifle. Then they dismembered his body with a kitchen knife, his own kitchen knife, from his own kitchen. But this isn't just a story about a gruesome murder. It's about the convicted child molester who committed it, the prison escape that made headlines across America, and the 54-day manhunt that forced the Grand Canyon to close for the very first time in its history. The killer left a trail that pointed straight back to him, a sawed-off rifle, a dead dog with a matching bullet in its skull, and a brother who eventually told the police everything. This is how Danny Ray Horning became the most wanted man in Arizona, and why they called him the prison break genius. A warm September evening on the San Joaquin River Delta is about as peaceful as California gets. The kind of night where you throw a line in the water and let the world go quiet. That's what a local fisherman was counting on when he came to Burns Cut on the outskirts of Stockton, looking for nothing more complicated than catfish. The tug on his line felt heavier than usual. He reeled it in, hand over hand, until a large black garbage bag broke the surface. He pulled it closer, curious. Then he opened it. Inside was a freshly severed human leg. By dawn, the quiet riverbank had become a crime scene. Deputies waded through the shallows, while detectives swept the edges with flashlights. The water gave up its secrets one by one. Another garbage bag, containing 2 severed arms, bound together at the wrists with duct tape. A human torso wrapped in a bedsheet. Finally, a head. Who had done this? And why had they taken the time to cut a man into pieces, rather than simply dump the body whole? Deputy Sheriff Armando Mayoya stepped into the scene and took on the role of lead investigator. Even for a man accustomed to violence, what he found that morning was something else. For someone to take the time to dismember a person, Mayoya would later say, and to transport them in different bags and just dispose of the body without caring, it's pretty callous and cold. The medical examiner identified the dead man through fingerprints. Sammy McCullough, 40 years old, a catfish farmer from East Mariposa Road, with a habit of keeping cash around his property. The autopsy revealed a .22 caliber bullet lodged in his brain, fired into his forehead at point-blank range. The body had been dismembered with a serrated blade. McCullough's white Jeep Cherokee turned up abandoned a few miles from his home, the floor mats still damp, the interior scrubbed recently. Someone had been careful. A witness named James Castro had been camping near Burns Cut the previous evening. He told investigators he had noticed a white Jeep Cherokee driving back and forth along the riverbank, fast, nervous. When it stopped, he heard crashes in the bushes and splashes in the water, like someone dumping garbage. Mayoya knew the shape of what had happened. The killer had murdered McCullough somewhere, transported the remains in the victim's own vehicle, and dumped the pieces near Castro's campsite. The question was where the murder had taken place. The answer was waiting at the house on East Mariposa Road. At first glance, the property looked almost ordinary. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no visible blood. It didn't look like a murder scene. Then a deputy crouched near the bathtub and noticed something small caught on the lip of the drain. A shiny fragment, no bigger than a grain of rice. It was human bone. When they pulled the plumbing apart, the trap told the whole story. Blood, tissue, and hair clotted in the drain. Someone had used this bathtub to cut a man apart. In the kitchen, one piece was missing from the cutlery set, a steak knife, the same serrated blade that had been found near the body in the river. Sammy McCullough had been murdered in his own home, dismembered in his own bathtub, using his own kitchen knife. Who would do something like this? And who hated Sammy McCullough enough to be this deliberate? How does a man end up on the wrong side of that kind of hatred? That's where the investigation started to get interesting. Mayoya ran McCullough's history. A known marijuana dealer, he had been robbed at gunpoint inside his own home 2 years earlier. The man arrested for that robbery was named Stephen Horning, one of 5 brothers from a rough family on the outskirts of Stockton. But it wasn't Stephen who interested Mayoya. It was another brother, the one everyone in town seemed to whisper about. Danny Ray Horning. When Mayoya sat down with the oldest Horning brother, the picture that emerged was less a biography than a warning. He described Danny as a man who could skin a deer in minutes, who cleaned with surgical precision, who never flinched at the sight of blood, a man who found something close to pleasure in the act of taking things apart. Then came the detail that froze the room. The oldest brother recalled the day Danny had shot a deer, dragged it into the bathroom of the family home, and dismembered it in the bathtub. He wrapped the pieces in garbage bags, cleaned the drain, scrubbed the tiles until they gleamed. The murder of Sammy McCullough hadn't just echoed that scene, it had replicated it, step by step, bag by bag. Had Horning rehearsed the murder deliberately? Had he practiced on the deer to prepare for what he planned to do to McCullough? Armed with a search warrant, deputies went to the Horning property. A small trailer sat behind the parents' home. Danny was gone. Near the fence line, a deputy noticed something in the grass. A rifle stock, snapped clean in two. Tests confirmed it was a Western Field Point .22 caliber rifle, the same caliber used to kill McCullough. Then, the father mentioned something about the family dog. One day, Danny and his brother had used the dog as a target. Danny shot it in the head with his .22. Then they buried it in the yard and moved on, like nothing had happened. Deputies dug up the grave. Inside the dog's skull was a single .22 caliber bullet. Ballistic tests confirmed that both bullets, the one taken from McCullough's brain and the one recovered from the dog, had been fired from the same sawed-off rifle found on the property. Danny Ray Horning had killed the dog and later killed a man the same way. One was a rehearsal, the other was the performance. Under interrogation, Stephen Horning eventually broke. He told detectives that Danny had sworn revenge on McCullough ever since the robbery charges sent him to prison in 1988. When McCullough pressed those charges, Danny made a promise. He would come back. He would settle it. But there was something else in Danny's file, something that made even experienced detectives pause. Danny Ray Horning had been released from prison just 3 months before the murder of Sammy McCullough. The conviction that put him there? A serious offense involving a minor. The victim was his own daughter. She was 5 years old. What kind of man does all of this? And more importantly, where was he now? By the time investigators had assembled the full picture, Danny Ray Horning had already vanished. His name sat in case files for over a year, from September 1990 until the spring of 1991, his face on posters that no one seemed to see. Until one spring morning, hundreds of miles away, he walked through a door he should not have opened. March 22, 1991, Winslow, Arizona. Danny Ray Horning entered the Valley National Bank, carrying a 9mm handgun. He pointed it at the manager and instructed the teller to fill a bag with cash. His voice was steady, his composure mechanical. The teller counted out $25,000. Under the desk, her trembling hand found the silent alarm. 2 minutes later, a detective from the Winslow Police Department stepped out of his unmarked car and looked through the glass doors. Inside, Horning was backing toward the exit with one arm locked around a hostage. The confrontation outside the bank lasted no longer than a heartbeat. The bag fell. The hostage ran. And Horning found himself at the wrong end of a drawn weapon. When officers ran his name through the system, the database returned a result that connected everything. Wanted for murder in Stockton, California. Back in California, Mayoya received the call that reopened his case. The Arizona detective reported that Horning had been arrested with a 9mm pistol. The serial number matched one of the firearms stolen from Sammy McCullough's home on the day he was killed. The gun had traveled from a bathtub in Stockton to a bank in Arizona, and it had brought Danny Ray Horning with it. Horning was convicted of armed robbery, assault, and kidnapping. During sentencing, he stood before the judge with something close to a smile and made a declaration that the court would not forget. "No matter how long you keep me behind bars," he said, "I won't stay." It was not bravado. It was a statement of intent from a man who genuinely believed it. The judge accepted the challenge. 4 consecutive life sentences. Florence State Prison, Arizona, one of the most secure facilities in the country. 9 months later, Danny Ray Horning would prove himself right. Florence State Prison was designed for men who had long since lost their claim on the outside world. Horning was housed in the maximum security central unit, but his work assignment handed him something no prison should give a man like him: time alone. As a janitor, he cleaned the infirmary and the kitchen. Guards often left him unsupervised. He used that time to observe, to memorize, to collect. From the kitchen, he obtained a pair of white pants. From the infirmary, he took a white lab coat. Along the way, he picked up an employee ID badge left carelessly on a desk. He didn't need a tunnel. He didn't need accomplices. He just needed patience and a uniform. Was it really going to be that simple? Could a man really walk out of one of America's most secure prisons wearing a stolen coat and holding someone else's badge? May 12, 1992, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The guards reached Danny Ray Horning's cell for the head count. The bed was neatly made, the walls untouched, the man himself gone. No breach in the fence, no sign of struggle, no alarm that had caught it happening, just an empty cell where a 4-time life sentence had been stored. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, dressed in white and carrying himself with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times, Danny Ray Horning walked out of Florence State Prison and into the open desert. What followed would become the largest manhunt in Arizona history. By nightfall, helicopters swept the sky. Search teams on horseback traced faint footprints across the sand. Dogs caught the scent and lost it again. The desert swallowed everything. 3 days later, a rancher 15 miles west of Florence came home to find his farmhouse ransacked. Clothes missing, food gone. A loaded .44 Magnum revolver missing from a drawer. On a window frame, investigators found a fingerprint that confirmed what they feared. Horning had been there. He was armed. He was moving north. The FBI took control of the investigation, and for the next several weeks, Danny Ray Horning became something the newspapers couldn't resist. He walked in circles and figure eights through the wilderness to confuse the tracking dogs. He broke into empty vacation homes, taking what he needed and leaving notes behind for the absent owners, handwritten, polite, thanking them for their hospitality. The newspapers called him Rambo, a lone man outwitting hundreds of officers, a fugitive the system couldn't catch. Horning didn't accept the compliment. He belittled his pursuers instead. Anyone who knows the woods could have done the same thing, he later told reporters. I just went down obstacle courses that the police are too lazy to go through. By late June 1992, Horning had been free for more than 6 weeks. The Arizona summer deepened into full heat. The pine forests of the north gave him cover, and somewhere in that cover, he made a decision that shifted everything from a manhunt into something closer to theater. He was going to kidnap a wealthy family at the Grand Canyon, hold them hostage, demand $1 million in cash, his freedom, and the release of his brother Jerry, who was serving time in Florence on child molestation charges. To Horning, this wasn't reckless, this was genius. On June 25th, he carjacked a middle-aged couple near Flagstaff at gunpoint, forcing them to drive to the canyon. That night, they checked into the historic El Tovar Hotel at the canyon's rim. Horning used a tape recorder to prepare his ransom demands. If they were not met, he promised, hostages would die. The next morning, June 26th, Horning spotted his real targets in the parking lot: a family with a travel trailer, a father, a mother, an uncle, and a 15-year-old son visiting from out of state. They looked like money. Horning approached the father near the trailer, pretending to be interested in buying one himself, asked if he could take a look inside. When they were alone at the back of the vehicle, he pulled his gun. But the 15-year-old son, watching from across the parking lot, sensed something was wrong. He walked around the trailer, saw the gun, saw his father's hands going up. What happened next was not in any of Horning's calculations. The boy ran. There was a park ranger nearby, a patrol car in the lot. Without hesitating for a single second, the boy sprinted toward it, waving his arms, shouting for help. Ranger Donnie Miller jumped into his vehicle and drove across the lot toward the trailer. A standoff erupted. Horning and the ranger faced each other through the car window, weapons drawn. Then Horning bolted. He reached the carjacked vehicle, jumped in, and floored it. Miller gave chase. Tourists scattered as the two vehicles tore through the park at 70 miles per hour. Near Hermit Road, Horning crashed through a gate and fired shots at the pursuing rangers through his rear window. Then he abandoned the wrecked car and disappeared into the forest on foot. The FBI understood the threat now in its full dimensions. Horning had attempted a kidnapping in broad daylight inside a national park. He was armed. He had fired at law enforcement. He would escalate. The response was unlike anything the Grand Canyon had ever seen. For the first time in the park's entire history, sections of the Grand Canyon National Park were closed to the public. The 4th of July weekend was approaching. Tens of thousands of tourists were expected. Instead, parking lots emptied. Trails fell silent. The canyon echoed only with the distant roar of helicopter blades cutting through the still air. More than 400 officers from the FBI, Park Service, state police, and county sheriff's departments converged on 1.3 million acres of rock and wilderness. Agents rappelled into crevices in the canyon walls. Tracking dogs worked through the pines in the heat. Roadblocks checked every vehicle leaving the park. Could one man really hide inside one of the most heavily watched pieces of land in America? For 8 days, the answer was yes. July 4th, 1992, Independence Day. Horning emerged from the trees near Desert View Point and approached 2 young women getting into a rented Nissan Sentra, British graduate students on a road trip through the American West. He climbed into the back seat with a gun and told them to drive. At the main gate, the roadblock officer leaned into the window. The woman in the driver's seat forced a smile, answered the questions, kept her voice level. In the back seat, Horning sat with his head down, a wide-brimmed straw hat pulled low. The officer waved them through. 20 miles on, a second roadblock at Valle. Another officer, another flashlight. The beam swept the back seat. Horning tilted his face down. The officer studied his face against the mugshot in his hand. Horning had shaved his beard, dyed his hair strawberry blonde. He didn't quite match the photograph. Would the officer look closer? Would he ask the man in the back to remove his hat? The officer thanked them, sent them on their way. The most wanted man in America had just passed through 2 police checkpoints with hostages in the front seat. 10 miles outside Williams, Horning directed the women off the highway onto a dirt road. They believed they were about to die. Instead, he tied them to a tree, left their luggage on the ground, and drove away in the rented Sentra. The knots were loose. They were free within minutes. They walked back to the highway and found a gas station, called the police. What Horning did not know was that his next hour would be his last free hour. A state trooper spotted the stolen Nissan on Interstate 40, heading toward Flagstaff at over 100 miles per hour. The chase lasted 25 miles. At one point, Horning fired his .44 revolver out the rear window. The shot shattered the trooper's windshield, missed him by inches. Near a freeway exit, Horning lost control and crashed into a signpost. He jumped out and vanished into the pines. But he had nothing left. By nightfall on July 5, 1992, Horning had descended into the Red Rock country near Sedona, exhausted, dehydrated, running on nothing. He wandered into a residential neighborhood in the village of Oak Creek, driven by the most basic need. He found a garden hose in someone's front yard and drank from it. The homeowner saw him, called the police. Deputies from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office arrived with bloodhounds. The dogs found the scent, led officers to a nearby house, and under the deck of that house, they found Danny Ray Horning, asleep. One hand wrapped around a loaded .44 caliber revolver. He surrendered without a fight, too weak to resist, too tired to run. 54 days on the run, hundreds of miles of desert, forest, and canyon. An entire national park brought to a halt. 400 officers, 2 roadblocks passed without detection, a high-speed chase with a revolver shot fired at a state trooper. It was over. When they pulled him out from under the deck, Horning grinned. "It was really a fun chase," he said. "I really enjoyed it." At his arraignment in Coconino County, the judge read through the charges. Horning waited until the list was finished. "Can you repeat all that?" he asked. "I might have missed one of your dotted I's or crossed T's." When informed his bail was set at $2 million, Horning grinned again. "Can I have 24 hours on the streets to come up with $2 million? The performance never stopped. Even at the end of everything, he was still playing the role. but at least one man saw through it clearly. "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of things," said Yavapai County Sheriff Buck Buchanan. "This is not a nice fellow. I had a great personal fear that there would be a murder or an officer would be shot before it was all over with. We were lucky." Lucky is a strange word for a resolution that had taken 54 days and the closure of a national park. But it was the right word, because with Danny Ray Horning, the alternative to lucky was someone coming home in a bag. Back in California, Deputy Armando Mayoya had never stopped working the McCullough case. For 3 years, he had watched Horning become a folk hero, Rambo of the desert, the genius who walked out of Florence in a lab coat, while the man whose body had been pulled from the San Joaquin River, one piece at a time, faded from the public memory. Mayoya lobbied the San Joaquin County District Attorney's Office to extradite Horning for murder. The McCullough family joined the effort. They wanted someone in a courtroom to say Sammy McCullough's name. In May 1993, California extradited Danny Ray Horning to stand trial for murder. The trial began in 1994. Horning arrived each day playing his role, the misunderstood outlaw, the charming rebel with a code. He told the jury, under oath, that he was a good guy with a good heart who does bad things. He admitted guilt for 6 bank robberies he had never been charged with. He even admitted, from the witness stand, that he had molested his own 5-year-old daughter. He called it the worst thing he had ever done. But killing Sammy McCullough? That he denied. A fellow inmate from Florence testified against him. He told the court that Horning had spoken about the murder while they were both incarcerated. According to this witness, Horning had said he killed a drug dealer, no big loss. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the bone fragment caught in McCullough's bathtub drain, the matching bullets from McCullough's brain and the family dog's skull, the 9mm pistol with McCullough's serial number found on Horning at the time of his arrest in Arizona. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. Would the charming outlaw narrative hold, or would the evidence finally show the jury who Danny Ray Horning really was? July 15, 1994. Guilty, first-degree murder, with special circumstances. During the penalty phase, Horning arrived in court with both hands raised in a V sign. For victory, he announced. He told the judge to skip the formalities. He already knew what was coming. January 26, 1995. Danny Ray Horning was formally sentenced to death. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison and placed on death row. 1 month after his arrival, an unknown attacker stabbed him 3 times. He was hospitalized in critical condition, but survived. No one was ever charged. The years that followed brought one legal motion after another. Appeals, petitions, reviews. None overturned the verdict. None produced a new trial, but they bought time. And on death row, time is the only currency that matters. California has not executed anyone since 2006. The state's death row has become a kind of permanent waiting room. More than 700 men are housed there. Most will die of natural causes before any execution is scheduled. As of 2023, Danny Ray Horning is 67 years old. He remains on California's condemned inmate list, alive, waiting, in a cell that looks nothing like the open desert where he once outran 400 officers. What makes a prison escape legendary? Usually it's the method, the audacity, the genius that makes people ask how anyone could have thought of that. Danny Ray Horning walked out of a maximum security prison wearing a stolen lab coat and an ID badge he found on a desk. No tunnel, no weeks of planning, no elaborate scheme, just a uniform, a face that looked like it belonged, and the nerve to walk past people who should have stopped him. For 54 days, he became something the newspapers couldn't stop writing about. He outmaneuvered search teams in the desert. He passed through roadblocks with hostages in the front seat. He forced the Grand Canyon to close. He fired at officers and walked away. He left thank you notes in the homes he robbed. To some people, he became a folk hero, a blue-collar rebel who beat a system that deserved to be beaten. The newspapers printed his notes. The public followed his movements like episodes of a serial drama. They didn't know about the bathtub. They didn't know about the bone fragment in the drain. They didn't know about the family dog with a .22 bullet in its skull. They didn't know about the 5-year-old daughter. Danny Ray Horning wasn't a genius. He was a predator who got lucky. A man who stumbled into fame because he could read a schedule and pick up a lab coat off a desk. Sammy McCullough was 40 years old when he died. He raised catfish, he sold marijuana. He was not a saint, but he did not deserve to be shot in the forehead and dismembered in his own bathtub with his own kitchen knife. Horning got 54 days of freedom and 30 years of infamy. McCullough got a garbage bag at the bottom of the San Joaquin River. That's the part of the story that doesn't make it into the newspapers. Danny Ray Horning remains on death row at San Quentin. The genius who walked out of Florence State Prison will probably die inside a California prison, not by lethal injection, most likely from old age, in a cell no bigger than the bathtub where his story really began. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.